And την παρθενίανε φύλαξας, εν τη κοιμήσει των κόσμων ου κατέλειπες Θεοτόκε, μετέστης προς την ζωήν μητήρ υπάρχους.
Why don't we rise? We'll begin with prayer. O Heavenly King, Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who are present everywhere, filling all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us. Cleanse us from every stain and save our souls, O gracious Lord. My hope is the Father, my refuge, the Son, my protection, the Holy Spirit, Holy Trinity, glory to you. I place all my hope in you, Mother of God. Keep me under your protection. Amen. Please be seated. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this morning for our second session of the adult education program about the life of the Virgin Mary. Last month we did a little introduction on why it's important to study the life of the Virgin, to understand why she's valuable for us, not only from a church perspective, but also on a personal level. So we'll be getting now into more of the story of her life, the different feast days and the different little snippets and stories that we have about her. And today we're going to be talking about the conception of the Virgin Mary, which is celebrated in our church on December 9th. A quick note, business item. On the flyer, there's a lecture that's scheduled for November 24th. We're going to be postponing that one because I have to fill in at another parish that day. So I'm not going to be here on the 24th, but we'll get to it. Whatever classes we miss during the scheduled times, we'll tack them on at the end. So you won't get shortchanged, I promise. You'll get your money's worth, so don't worry about it. So, without further ado, we will go into our subject matter for the day, conception of the Virgin Mary. Everybody got the quote sheet? Okay, very good. So this is a quote I thought was a nice way to start, or a nice place to start. This is from Metropolitan Ierotheos of Nafpaktos. I've quoted him before. He's a modern day, he's alive right now. He's a bishop of Greece in Nafpaktos. He's a theologian. And he writes that the countdown for salvation of the human race started from the day Saint Anna conceived. So this again plugs into the story of salvation, which is what we studied 2 years ago, the feasts of the Lord, the story of Christ becoming a man, and all the things that took place for the salvation of humanity. But if we go even back further, it really starts with when the Panagia becomes a person, when she's conceived and she becomes that person. So Metropolitan Ierotheos expresses that here, that really the story of our whole salvation begins at this moment, even before Christ is conceived in the womb of the Virgin. So we're going to start by talking about what they're labeled as the righteous ancestors of God, and those are the figures of Joachim and Anna. This is an icon here of Joachim and Anna with the Panagia as a child in the middle. And so we have these two parents of the Virgin Mary, or Joachim. And Joachim is of the tribe of Judah, and Anna, who is of the tribe of Levi. And in ancient Israel, what tribe you were from was very important. So for example, Judah, the tribe of Judah, was the tribe from which King David came from. It was the royal tribe. You know, all the kings are to come from this tribe. And then the tribe of Levi is the priestly tribe in ancient Israel. And so you have these two kind of functions of the ancient Israel civilization, which is the king and the priest, represented in the parents of the Virgin Mary. And of course, Christ, who is their grandson, will assume both of those roles in a mystical, kind of universal, cosmic sense, that he is the king of heaven, he is the king of a new kingdom, and he will be the priest who offers himself on behalf of all of humankind and all of creation. And that's what a priest is. A priest is someone who offers things to God. So he will offer, first of all, himself, and he will continually offer himself even into the kingdom. So Their lineage and where they come from is important, and it's significant, for even going forward to Christ. And so I'll talk a little bit more now about that lineage of David that I just referred to. So Joachim is a direct descendant of David the king. So David, for those of you that are not as familiar with the Old Testament, this is the same David who slays Goliath with a slingshot. He's a shepherd boy. He's kind of a small guy in the Israelite army. He prays to God that he can defeat this giant and rescue his people. And God blesses him, and he slays Goliath. And throughout, there's a lot of other steps in the process. He eventually becomes the anointed king of Israel, and he unifies the kingdoms, and he establishes a capital in Jerusalem. So for the Israelites, for the Jews, David is hugely important. He's also a prophet. He wrote the book, many of the Psalms that we find in the Old Testament. So David is a very important figure. And that Joachim comes from his line is significant because the Jews were anticipating that the Messiah, the one who would save their people, would come from this line, would come from David's own line. And that has to do with a promise that God made to David in the Old Testament. And it's the long quote in your sheet, on your sheet there. I posted it here, but I think it might be easier to follow along on the sheet. But I wanted to have the whole promise there so you can really get a sense of the relationship that David has with God. So this is now an angel of the Lord speaking to the prophet the prophet Nathan. And Nathan is David's basically his top advisor. And so now God is giving this message to Nathan to give to David. And so we have the angel now speaking to Nathan, and he says, "Tell your servant David," this is now what the angel says to Nathan, "when your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." So now David has, at this point of his life, he's become the king. He has overcome Saul, who's mentioned there. Saul was the first king of Israel, so to speak. David was the first king of the united Israel. Saul had been previously anointed as king over part of the tribes, some of the tribes. And so Saul is eventually killed in battle, and David is anointed as the new king. And now David is lamenting that he hasn't built God a temple. He's lamenting, he's feeling bad that he never built God a temple. And so now God is speaking to David, saying, "Don't worry about building the temple. I will raise up your family, basically, your descendants from you, and your son will build my temple." But what's more important than that is the last couple lines there where it says, "Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." And so God in this moment promises to David that one of his descendants will always be on the throne of Israel, will always be the king. And that's why for the Jews, the Messiah, who they anticipated would be an earthly king, someone that would overthrow the Romans and reestablish the Israelite nation, would come from David's line and would be this mighty king and would, like I said, overthrow Rome and kind of set things back as they ought to be. So they were waiting for a Messiah to come from the seed of David. And so Joachim comes from this seed. Now, if we extrapolate forward, as I had mentioned earlier, of course, this promise that God gives to David is truly fulfilled and eternally fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. On the left, this is an icon of David's family. And so there's like lots of kings. I know it's kind of hard to see on the screen, but there's lots of king figures. They're wearing crowns. They're all holding scrolls. These are David's descendants. And in the middle, in this tree, there's like a tree trunk in the middle, is Panagia with Christ. And so Panagia and Christ come out of this same lineage of the King David, fulfilling the promise, so to speak, that God had given to David. On the bottom of the tree, you'll see there's kind of an old man that's reclining, and that is Jesse. That's the father of David. So it's kind of like when you hear in hymnology that from the root of Jesse sprang forth the virgin, it's because it's connecting Panagia and Christ to David is really what it's doing. And on the right, I have an icon here of the resurrection of Christ. And if you look all the way on the left, there's kind of an older looking man with a crown. Well, that's King David as well. So again, even in our iconographic tradition, the resurrection of Christ, which is the forever establishment of the kingdom of God on earth, even there David is present in the icon at least, showing that the promise to God is being fulfilled. That's okay. Morning, Father. So we have this connection here between Panagia and Christ and David, and that's very important. This is one of the hymns from Orthodox. It's one of the kathismata of Orthodox. And it says, David, raise your voice and cry, what is it God has sworn to you? What he swore to me, said he, meaning David, behold, he likewise has fulfilled. For as the fruit of my loins he bestowed the virgin. From her, the fashioner and the new Adam, Christ has been born a king to sit upon my throne. And as a king today he reigns who has a kingdom unshakable. So this hymn kind of expresses everything that we had just been talking about. That David now sees, kind of in this mystical sense, the promise God made to him being fulfilled. And now this new kingdom, this new Israel, new Jerusalem is being fashioned by Christ himself. And this is a kingdom that will never fall. Because remember, when Christ comes, Jerusalem has fallen at that point, which was devastating. Because again, the Davidic line, it's broken. The kingdom that God had promised Israel was lost. And so they were waiting for this Messiah to kind of set things right. And that person, the Messiah, is Christ. It wasn't the Messiah they were expecting, but it was the one that God had intended from all along. So this is a beautiful little hymn that kind of encapsulates all of that. Oops. Okay, Joachim and Anna, they have a big problem though. So in ancient Israel, being barren, not being able to have children, was a sign of a reproach and a curse, because children are a blessing. They believed that God blessed families and opened the womb so that they could have children. And so for those that were not able to have children, it was seen to be God was cursing them, or that they had sinned in some way. So I just want to make sure I didn't skip any. Yeah, okay, good. Forgive me. I did skip one, see. So the reason why that's a problem is because Joachim and Anna were not sinful people. They are righteous before the Lord. They follow the law. They are righteous. They offer sacrifices. In the account in the Proto-Evangelion of James, which we talked about last month as one of the sources for the life of the Virgin Mary, which even though it's not accepted as scripture, is oftentimes quoted by the church fathers, talks about how Joachim was very wealthy, and God had blessed him as a shepherd with many sheep and abundant flocks because of his almsgiving, because a third of his property he gave to those who were in need, and a third of his property he gave to the temple and to the worship of the church, and he only kept a third for himself. And it says that he would offer whatever sacrifices were called for, he would offer double. So Joachim was even though he was wealthy, he was very generous. He was always giving. And they were a couple that was married for quite a long time. Some sources state that they were even married for 50 years without being able to have a child. They were married young, about 20 years old, in the account, again, of the Proto-Evangelion. So imagine now a couple in their 70s, righteous before God, all these years living sinlessly as much as possible, offering their sacrifices, being dutiful according to the law, and they're still without a child, which again is a reproach. It's a sign that God has cursed you. So there's something here that's not quite right. Why would God not bless Joachim and Anna with children? And so there's a quote here from St. Gregory Palamas that kind of states the same thing. It says, Joachim and Anna lived together blamelessly before God, but seemed to the Israelites to be at fault according to the law because they remained childless. So again, it was almost a sign of embarrassment. So I mean, as Greeks, we do the same thing, right? Like when we gather with people we know, it's like, oh, how's your family? How are your kids, right? Well, if you don't have any kids to speak of, for them it would have been an embarrassment. It would have been a sign, again, that God had abandoned them and had not heard their prayers or seen their righteousness, even though they were righteous. So this is a problem. And this problem comes to a head one year on the great day of the Lord. Joachim goes to offer his sacrifices, as he always did, because he was righteous in the sight of God. And he comes to the temple, and the high priest Reuben denies his sacrifices. He tells him, take your sacrifices and go home. And that's what you see in this icon on the left. This is a mosaic icon from the monastery of Khora in modern-day Istanbul, which used to be a monastery. Now it's a museum. But in this monastery, they have many beautiful mosaic icons of the scenes of the life of the Virgin Mary. And this is one of those scenes. So you have in this, you can see there's like a structure over the figure in the middle. So the structure is representative of the temple where the sacrifices would be made. This is the high priest Reuben, and his hands are up, telling Joachim, I don't accept your sacrifices. And the reason why his offerings are rejected is because he has no children. Again, it seemed that Joachim and Anna were unrighteous because they had no children. In the Proto-Evangelion of James, Joachim is very upset by this. And he goes to the registry of the nations of Israel. And he goes, I can't be the only righteous man without children. And he goes and he checks out all the families. And in this account, it says that Joachim found that he was the only righteous man without children in all of Israel. And so he's very distraught. And again, it's a sign that something is off. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. Why are these righteous people suffering in such a humiliating fashion? So this is a hymn from the Canon of the Feast of the Conception of Panagia. The sacred Joachim and the thrice blessed Anna offered their gifts unto the priests of the old law, and having been rejected for their childlessness, offered up a fervent prayer to the giver of all things. And he hearkened to their cries, and most graciously granted to them the holy gate of life herself. Let us all honor her conception now. So I wanted to include this because it again shows that even though sources like the Proto-Evangelion of James are not scriptural, they influence and inform our church tradition. This is a hymn of our church. It's an established hymn on the feast day. It's chanted on the feast day of the Conception of Panagia. And this hymn is completely informed and taken from the account of the Proto-Evangelion of James. So I wanted to include that there to reinforce that just because something is not necessarily scriptural, the church does validate certain things or use certain information from these accounts to inform their feast days and their worship and their honoring of especially the Virgin Mary in this case. So, Joachim and Anna are devastated by having their offerings rejected. And Joachim leaves, he flees, he doesn't even go home, he just goes into the wilderness. And he decides that he's going to pray, as the hymn said, he's going to pray to God, and he's going to beseech God until God gives him an assurance that his prayer will be answered. So this is another one of those monastery of Khora icons. And this is Joachim. You can see he's praying by himself. He's kind of like hunched over. He's got his head on his hand. And he has a very distraught position. He's by himself, and he's kind of like in this bush figure. So it's a sign that he's out in the wilderness praying. And he remains there fasting and praying for 40 days and 40 nights, which again is a prefiguration. Christ will do the same thing after his baptism. It's a prefiguration of Christian fasting periods. 40 days, 40 is a sign of completion. The Israelites are in the desert for 40 years, for example. So 40 is a sign of completion. So after these 40, so Joachim's out there 40 days and 40 nights. Anna, meanwhile, remains alone in her house. And the both of them, the account says, call to mind the patriarch Abraham. And this will lead us into the next theme, which is in the Bible, the barren woman motif. So Joachim and Anna are not the only righteous couple in the Bible that have a hard time having kids. So we have, for example, the patriarch Abraham, which I just mentioned in the last slide, patriarch Abraham and Sarah, who are over 100 years old when they can finally conceive through the intercessions of God himself, through the direct involvement of God himself. You have their son Isaac and Rebekah. It says in the scriptures, and Isaac prayed for his wife Rebekah that she may have a child because she was childless. So Isaac prays on her behalf, and eventually she does bear a son, and their son is Jacob. Jacob and Rachel have problems having kids. Eventually, through their prayers, they're able to bear children. One of the judges, Samson, who I think many know him, his story is kind of popular. He's a really strong guy who, as long as he doesn't cut his hair, he'll have this like superhuman strength. His parents, his mother was barren, and there's a story in the Old Testament of how she prayed and her prayers were answered and they had a son. There's Elkanah and Hannah, who are Old Testament couple, and I'll show you in the next slide who they bear, but they have a hard time having kids. And then Zechariah and Elizabeth are also another New Testament couple that are kind of in the same boat. Elizabeth is not able to conceive. And it's kind of the same story. They're all very distraught, and they go and they pray to God because they have nowhere else to turn. They have nowhere else to go. Medicine of that time was not what it is today. The only really resort of these couples had, because again, childlessness is a reproach. It's not a good thing. It's very bad. So it means you're unrighteous. So that was not a good thing. So all these couples kind of go through this difficult moment of not being able to have children. And we have their fulfillments through God. And so you have Abraham and Sarah, have Isaac, who is the child of promise. I mean, God promises Abraham, from you will come many nations. Well, for that to happen, there has to be a child. And so they pray, Abraham prays, and the promise is fulfilled through their son Isaac. And then Isaac and Rebekah have Jacob. Jacob is the one who wrestles with God, the one who God blesses and changes his name, and is given the name Israel, who then is the namesake for the whole nation afterwards. So kind of a big deal again. Jacob and Rachel have Joseph. Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, same story. Joseph goes into Egypt. He's sold by his brothers into Egypt. He becomes a great king of the Egyptian people. He saves all the Israelites who come to Egypt during the famine. Samson delivers the Israelites from the Philistines, one of their mortal enemies. Elkanah and Hannah, their son becomes Samuel the prophet. And then you also have Zacharias and Elizabeth. Their son is John the Baptist. So all of these righteous couples in the Bible, they pray, their prayers are heard, and they bear children, male children in this case, that become leaders of their people. They become leaders of the Israelites or their tribe. So this is a common thing in the scriptures. And so Joachim and Anna are in the same boat. So we have on the left here an icon. This is Saint Anna, Panagia, and Christ. You have kind of like the family picture, right? Joachim's not in it, but what Anna, Panagia, and Christ are there. And what we'll see is that now from Joachim and Anna, they don't have a male son, they have a female daughter. They have a daughter. And she will take this motif even one step further. She's not barren. She bears in her virginity. She doesn't even have a male partner, so to speak, to all these other couples conceived of natural means. Panagia, again, takes it kind of to that next level where she bears even in her virginity by the divine energies of God and His grace. And so we have down here, I included an icon of the Annunciation where Panagia kind of enters into this motif in a new way. She almost fulfills the motif, really, where she's not barren, but the Virgin herself bears. And her son, of course, is Christ, the Savior of all. So I think it's important to be aware that Joachim and Anna kind of fit into this mold. They fit into this motif. So the element of this motif, the first element I want to talk about is prayer. So Joachim prays in the wilderness, and Anna goes into her garden to pray. And this is a beautiful, if you ever read the Protevangelion, it's not very long. I recommend finding a copy and reading it. It talks about Anna going into her garden at the 9th hour, which is about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, for a walk. And she prays to God, and she says, "O God of our fathers, bless me and hear my prayer, as you did bless the womb of Sarah and did give her a son, Isaac." So that's another reason why it's important to know the references, right? Like, there was precedent for this. Joachim and Anna were able to have faith that God would answer their prayer because others had had their prayers answered first. So Anna prays to God that He will bless them as He blessed Abraham and Sarah, even in their old age. Anna goes on to start bemoaning. She's like, even the earth is more fruitful than me. Even the birds of the air are more fruitful than me. And she's kind of very distraught. And she has kind of this moment of where it all kind of streams out. So it's a beautiful little passage. So Anna and Joachim are praying. And then the Lord hears their prayers. He sends an angel to both of them, to Joachim and to Anna, and tells them that God has heard their prayer and that they will bear a child, and that this child will be dedicated to God and will be spoken of throughout the world. And this is an icon of Anna praying, and on the left is Anna, on the right is Joachim, and there's the angel coming down to tell them basically the good news that they're going to have a child. Their prayers are going to be answered. And not only answered, but in this magnificent way where the child will be the mother of God himself. So this is a hymn from the Vespers of the feast. Anna heard the voice of an angel that gave assurance to her promising divine fulfillment of her prayers. That gave assurance to her promising divine fulfillment of her prayers. The bodiless minister, meaning the angel, then declared to her openly, "Your supplication is come near and has reached the Lord. Put away your tears. Be not downcast nor sorrowful, for you shall truly be a fruitful olive tree, putting forth a comely branch, even Mary, the Virgin, who shall bear in the flesh Christ Jesus." Now, Joachim and Anna don't hear the announcement that they're going to be the grandparents of God, right? They don't hear that their grandson will be the Messiah. This is kind of added in artistically there because we know the end of the story as the church. But Joachim and Anna are told that they will have a child and she will be famous throughout all the world. This element of the second element of this motif of the barren woman is dedication. So as you notice, all those people who are having trouble having children, they pray, their prayers are answered, and their children are kind of these like really important leaders in the community. And so these children that come through the promise and the grace of God, the parents then dedicate them to the Lord's service. We have, for example, like Zechariah and Elizabeth, right? The angel comes to tell them that they're going to have a child, and the angel tells Zacharias, "Your son will not drink strong drink. He will be he will lead his people, etc., etc." Samson, it's the same thing. When Samson's mother is told that she's going to bear a son, it's the same kind of thing. Like he will be dedicated to God. He will not drink strong drink. You will not cut his hair, etc., etc. So we have this dedication. This idea of dedication. So Anna promises, she of her own free will, promises that when she bears a child, that she will offer it to God as a gift. She will offer the child back to God, who will serve God all the days of her life. And so we'll see this kind of fulfilled, this promise that Anna now makes fulfilled when the Panagia is 3 years old. Joachim and Anna will take her to the temple, where then she will live in the temple apart from her parents, until the time that she is betrothed to Joseph. We'll get that. That's a couple lectures down the line. So I just wanted to kind of bring it up. And then, of course, Panagia herself serves the Lord her whole life, kind of very dramatically at the Annunciation, where she says, "Behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord. Let it be done to me according to your will." So Panagia is dedicated by her parents to the service of God, and then she dedicates herself to the service of God by being the mother of Jesus. So Joachim returns from the wilderness and he rests on the first day. The next day he goes and offers sacrifices, and then shortly thereafter they come together and Anna conceives. And so this is an icon here of Joachim and Anna, Joachim returning from the wilderness. In the Proto-Evangelion it uses the phrase, "and Anna hung on his neck," meaning like she embraced him, like around her. She was so happy to see him at that point. She embraced him, and that's kind of what you see here, the embrace of Joachim and Anna. And so they're able to conceive. Anna conceives. Now, I wanted to just make something clear. I'm not going to belabor the point. But, is the theology of the Immaculate Conception part of our tradition? Because in the West, in the Catholic Church, for example, they hold the theology of the Immaculate Conception. And for us, it's never been a part of our theological tradition. It's never been taught by any of the fathers. It was never included in any of the councils. And so it's not something that we ascribe to. It's something that a lot of theologians openly reject. So what the Immaculate Conception is, and I hope I'm representing this correctly, is that the Virgin Mary, when she was conceived by Joachim and Anna, God basically gave her a special blessing, a special endowment of grace that cleansed her of the original sin. And so that basically she would be blessed in this very unique way to be able to be the mother of Jesus. So this is what the theology or the teaching of the Immaculate Conception is, that because of the merits of her future Son, Jesus Christ, the God gave her a special blessing that her original sin was cleansed even from the moment of her conception. She never had that original sin was taken from her instantly. For us, again, it has never been an accepted teaching. For us, Mary is conceived and carried in the womb and born in the same way that everyone else is. She's not given any special grace or any special blessing. Rather, what we see in the life of the Panagia is that everything, her purity, her holiness, which our church holds in one of our teachings of our tradition, is that in her life she never had any personal sin. She never sinned. She never did anything sinful in her life, which is why we call her Panagia, which means all holy. She did it out of the use of her own free will. She did it out of the use of her own faculties, her own freedom, her own power within her, through the grace of God, of course. But it is has a little bit different implications than, for example, the Catholic teaching of the Immaculate Conception. So for us, Panagia, even more so to me, becomes an amazing figure, because imagine, like all of us in our temptations, how easily we fall into our temptations and how easily we fall away from the teachings of God. Panagia is born into the same reality that we are, with the same strengths, the same weaknesses, and she overcomes everything. She lives a very pure and holy life. So I just wanted to draw that distinction so that there's no confusion, because I know I've had discussions with Orthodox who aren't sure about whether we accept these teachings or not. So I just wanted to make that point. I'm not going to belabor it. If you have questions after, we can discuss. So the last thing we'll talk about is that this story is a microcosm of the divine economy. Earlier I talked about how the story of Joachim and Anna, something's off in the story of Joachim and Anna. They live righteously, they're sinless, they offer sacrifices, they're doing everything they're supposed to be doing, that God himself directs them to do. Think about that. The law is given by God. They're following all his rules, and they're still living like they're cursed. Something's off. And so we see God then intervene. He acts directly in their life to correct the brokenness, to heal the brokenness. He acts in a way that sets to right the wrongs that they were experiencing. And this, in a small way, foreshadows really everything that Christ will come and do. There's a passage in the New Testament where John the Baptist's disciples come to Christ. And they ask him, how do we know that you are the one that we're waiting for? Are you the one that we're waiting for, or is there another? We're still going to be waiting. And Jesus says, go and tell John what you have seen. The blind see, the lepers are cleansed, the lame walk, the dead, or those who mourn receive their dead alive again. And so Jesus in those words is saying, I have come and now I'm setting to right all the things that have gone wrong over the course of human history. From Adam and Eve, their sin came in death and sickness and all these brokenness in our humanity, and Christ will come and undo that. And so this story of Joachim and Anna, at least in my mind, is kind of that foreshadowing that God now is going to act. He is going to take a direct interest and a direct part in the healing of humankind, just like he does for Joachim and Anna, in healing their reproach and making them whole again. And so I think this is an important story and a kind of a good starting point for the life of the Panagia, also connecting to Christ, to show us that God is always acting on our behalf. He's always working for our salvation. It's many times just a matter of, is our heart open to receiving him and to receiving his grace and his love? This is another hymn from the Canon of the feast. It says, the tides of evil begin to dry up, and the rivers of grace are set right in their course to burst forth, as your birth is proclaimed today, all exceedingly exalted Virgin. So it's kind of paints a nice picture, right? All these rivers of evil have been running through humanity. Well, those rivers are starting to dry up. And now these rivers of grace are springing forth. Why? Because Christ is on his way. The moment that Joachim and Anna conceive, Christ's coming is imminent at that point. And so we see now the tides of human history are beginning to turn. They're beginning to change through the conception of the All-Holy Virgin. The last thing is that in this feast, we also see the theme of how we are called to bear fruit. Anna is barren. Through her prayers, she's able to bear fruit through God's grace. The same thing for us. When in our spiritual lives we find ourselves to be barren, when we find that we're struggling to bear fruit to God, this story, this feast especially, the hymns that we hear, is a reminder, is an encouragement that no matter how dried up we are, our spiritual life is, we can still bear fruit to God through His grace and through our own synergy with Him, through our own co-working with Him. And this is an icon of Christ, the vine, as He uses that parable, I am the vine, you are the branches. And He talks about bearing fruit to God. So I wanted to include that there about how, all of us as members of the church are part of the vineyard of God, where Christ is the vine and we are His branches, and we're called to bear fruit. And even if we don't bear fruit right now, through our prayers, through our repentance, through our struggle in the spiritual life, we can bear fruit one day. Last hymn, the Canon of the Feast, again, drive away all the unfruitfulness of my barren mind, make my soul fruitful with virtues, O all-holy Theotokos, help of the faithful. And so this hymn calls particularly on Panagia to help with our barrenness, our fruitlessness, so that we can be fruitful to God. Okay, I know that was a lot. I was thinking this morning on my car ride, I was like, Orthodoxy is like a piece of fruit that's so juicy that when you cut into it, it just like explodes all over you. Like that happened to me once. I was in Greece. I thought I had tasted really good oranges, but I went to Greece once, and my Thea had an orange tree, and she gave me an orange, and I like opened it up, and it like just exploded everywhere. Well, that's how I was like thinking of, that's like our Orthodox tradition. Like it's just, once you put the knife to make a little scrape, it just all comes like gushing out because there's so much in there. There's so much life and so much juice, so to speak, for us to squeeze out. And even if we only got a little bit today, I'm glad that we were able to dig in a little bit. So, any questions at this time? Joachim and Anna, conception of the Panagia? Anything like that?
Joachim was David's son?
Not son, but somewhere down the line, great. So David lives around like 1000 BC. Joachim and Anna are like 70 BC, right? So they're like just before the coming of Christ. So like there's a pretty big gap in between there, but Joachim is part of his line of descendants coming down from David. He's a direct descendant of David the king, but not his son, no. Like great times 20 grandson, something like that.
You're quite a historian, Father.
What was that?
You're quite the historian.
Not me, the church is quite the historian. All this information is easily accessible if you do a little digging, so. Any other questions? All right, in that case, you are dismissed. Go in peace, not in pieces, as my teachers used to say in seminary. Thank you. God bless.
Tine presvies ακίμη των Θεοτόκων και προστασίες αμετάθετων ελπίδαν, τάφος και νεκρόσεις που και κράτησεν, ως γαρ ζωής μητέρα προς την ζωήν μετέστησεν, ο μητρανικήσαν.